Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Helfand, the rabbinic intern at Shulman Torah Synagogue. This is the weekly Lunch and Learn. We're a little sparse on people in the Zoom room, so I'll wait a few minutes, but also just go ahead and start sharing sources. And if people want to follow along, we can follow along virtually on our own time. Going to dedicate our learning today as International Holocaust Memorial Day. So to the many who lost their lives during the time of the Holocaust, we remember them today and we'll dedicate our learning in their honor. And to whoever you want to spend some time in memory or in honor of this afternoon learning together, we'll dedicate learning to them together. And we'll say the bracha for learning Torah, Baruch Ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, God, King of the universe, who's given us this commandment to fulfill the beauty and the blessings of immersing ourselves in the words of Torah and going swimming in that sea of Torah. This week we read Parshat Mishpatim, and following Revelation, where God reveals God's self and communicates the ultimate religious truths at Mount Sinai, Mishpatim, the parsha we read this week, comes and expands upon the ideas of mitzvot and the ideas of laws. And there are mainly civil laws that govern the Jewish people, and there are laws relating to slaves, to their release of slaves, to personal injury, property law, laws of social responsibility, justice, compassion. And then there's a hint towards the laws of Shabbat and festivals towards the in our parsha. And at the end, there is this scene which Moses then goes up to the mountains for 40 days and has a conversation with God, which will lead us into next week's parsha as well. But in particular, Mishpatim really speaks about these ideas of laws vis-a-vis social justice. And so what we're going to do here, I guess, together, is we're going to look at some of these ideas, specifically that of the idea of loving the stranger. This is a mitzvah, a commandment that is so core to the Jewish people and so core to our society that the Torah mentions it so many times. Over 30 plus times this idea is mentioned in our Torah. And so we're going to look together at two verses from our parsha to see what they have to say. And then we'll look at a couple of the sources. And if you'd like to join me, you're welcome to join me here in the Zoom room. You can join through the stsonline.org website, and you can click on Lunch and Learn and join us here. And I hope I'm broadcasting correctly today. It says that this is the Lunch and Learn. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. We'll learn some Torah together, and we'll go from there. One second. Here we go. Okie dokie. So again, Parshat Mishpatim, we're learning about the idea of loving the stranger. Twice in our parsha, we read a similar verse about the notion of loving the stranger. Chapter 22, verses 20 to 21, it reads, V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchaltsenu ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. That you shall not wrong a stranger or an orphan or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. The second verse from Exodus 23, chapter 23, verse 9, V'ger lo tilachatz ve'atem yidatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So right off the bat, we're in two different places about the importance of not treating the stranger poorly. So the question is, where does this come from? And perhaps we can see in the text itself that because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt, and while we might not have felt strangers because we lived our lives, we had a community, but we were still oppressed by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But once we've left Egypt, it's a reminder to us that we always have to remember the place that we came from. We have an entire holiday dedicated to this with the holiday of Passover, right? We say Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, that we should remember the exodus from Egypt. But more importantly, before we actually left Egypt itself, we have to remember that we were slaves. So clearly there's something fundamental at stake with this idea of creating some sort of just order for loving everybody. So there's a lot of commentaries surrounding this. And on the one hand, it talks about the powerlessness of the stranger. Someone who is a minority struggles immensely with trying to fit in. And we see this in the homelessness community. We see this within people of different marginalized communities. And because of that, it's extra important for us to be aware of the people who are in our world. But on the second hand, there's also a piece of vulnerability. The stranger, in this particular instance of these two verses, the stranger is one who lives outside of the normal securities of home and a sense of belonging. They feel alone. And throughout the Torah, God is especially sensitive to the people who are oppressed, to those who feel like they are rejected, and to those cries that go unheard of. This is really emotional. And there's a really emotional dimension of depth with this that is really an extra emphasis upon the command. There's one more insight that I didn't bring here, but I want to just share that the Or HaChaim, it's a famous commentary, a medieval commentator, Rabbi Chaim Iter Atar, he says that it might be that the children of the covenant of the Jews may look down upon those who are not Jewish. Because we are so-called the chosen people, we cannot look little upon or down upon those who may not be within the covenant. And therefore, we're commanded not to feel superior to the ger, to this minority, to this stranger, but instead to remember the degradation that came through our experiences in Egypt, and that it's a command that really is about humanity and really creating a sense of community and love and eliminating this idea of humility and of insult within the idea of the stranger. And whichever way we look at it, right, there's something really powerful about it. And together, it's an important reminder for us that we need to remember everybody and love everybody. Oh, someone's here. So as we welcome them in, I'll just say that this two verses in particular are so powerful, as I mentioned, that they come up again and again and again throughout the Torah. I think it's 36 times, depending on how you do we understand that we have to love the stranger, love the widow, love the orphan. But we're also commanded in Leviticus that we have to love ourselves and we have to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so there's this interesting conflict, perhaps, that we have of how do we love ourselves while also loving everybody else. If we move towards the Talmud and Tractate Baba Metzia, which deals with, again, more concepts of legal matters, and it's one of three of the larger contexts that have to deal with justice. It's taught in Baba Metzia that Rabbi Eliezer the Great said, "Why did the Torah warn against the wronging of a stranger in 36, or as some say 46 times? Because he might return to his former bad ways in response." So the rabbis of the Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer the Great, asked the question, why are we saying this so many times? We don't have Shema Yisrael 36 times. We don't have the prayer, the line of Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha. We don't have this idea of loving God with all of our heart, all of our strength, all of our might, all of our soul. But the phrase that comes up over and over and over is that of loving the stranger, loving the other, creating a space where each of those people can feel as if they are united as one people. And so his rationale is because he might return to his former bad ways in response. So the question is, what are the bad ways that once were? Perhaps it's just the negative reaction in response to all the terrible things that were going on in the land of Egypt. And they're going to respond to say, we had it better there. Or, you know what? They weren't as bad to us as we might have thought. Comes the Talmud to say further, what is the meaning of the verse? You shall neither wrong a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It has been taught by Rabbi Natan said, Do not taunt your neighbor with the flaw you yourself have. In reading this piece, we can see from it, I think, two things. Number one, that we each have our own flaws, that we each have our own things in our life that we want to work on to make ourselves better, right? Do that tikkun, that repair, that inner challenge to ourselves to make ourselves better. But on the other hand, we can't go and brag about how I was saved from Egypt. And we can't go and brag about how we have it so much better, because that brings out the flaws in us of not creating a society, of not creating a world, of not creating a humanity where we can all attempt to help each other grow, where we can all attempt to help each other learn and grow from the flaws that are inside of each of us, but also with inside humanity as a whole. And I think that this is really powerful. It's a really powerful idea that we see now, where there are some people who have it a little bit better than others. And so how do those people who have it better than others work towards a tikkun, a repair that will make themselves more aware that there are other people out there who also need that help to do the tikkun, who also need a space where they can feel loved, a space where they can feel as if they are part of a community. And in thinking about this idea of loving the stranger, in response to now 2 weeks ago in Colleyville, Texas, is how do we create a space where we can love the other and create an opening for these people and an opening for our own selves. Hi, Marilyn. Hi, Ellen. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Nice to see you all. How do we create a space where these people can feel together, where we can not taunt about the flaws, but perhaps the opposite of taunt about the love, and show off that we really love people and show them how we love people and how we're able to bring together the worlds. So if you're just joining us, we're looking at 2 verses in the book, in this parsha of Mishpatim, that deal with a lot of different legal codes and laws. The first verse says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." A reminder of where we just came from. "You shall not ill-treat any widow or any orphan." The second verse says, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourself been strangers in the land of Egypt." I think that for us, we have to think about, why are these important and why are we still talking about it today? And so what we're going to look at is a couple of modern sources. Right? We saw the Talmud tell us that we say this verse more than any other verse. And we saw that we're not supposed to taunt our fellow to say that we have it better than you, because we all have our own inner flaws and we all have our own inner struggles. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of modern sources to help us kind of see this in a more modern lens, and how this idea of not oppressing or wronging or shaming somebody else can be applied in our own modern day understandings. So the first person we're going to look at is Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who's a famous Reform rabbi and author, does a lot of work in Kabbalistic and mysticism, and is also just a really important person for us to be to look at, because he really brings such a wealth of wisdom to modern day life. He said it would be forgivable to ourselves the solace of dwelling on our victimization as slaves in Egypt, but instead we celebrate it. We reshape it into the most frequently repeated explanation of any law in the entire Torah, over and over again. Our slavery, instead of embittering us, generates an obligation to identify with anyone who is socially powerless or politically disenfranchised. We say it so many times that it's become a mantra to us. It's become a Jewish mantra. But what does it really mean for us? It would be forgivable if we permitted ourselves the solace of dwelling on our own victimizations of slaves in Egypt. If we remembered, if we really felt that we were slaves in Egypt, that would be one thing. But none of us know what it was like to be a slave in Egypt. None of us were there, despite what my 5th grade Chumash teacher tells me, right? None of us were there. But instead, we have to celebrate, reshape it into our own most frequently repeated explanation of any law in the Torah, right? The Talmud just told us that we see it 36 or 46, depending on how they count, times in the Torah. And you would think that after the fourth or fifth time, again, we only have 2 sets of 10 commandments that we read. One in Shemot, which we read last week, and one in Deuteronomy, which we'll read again in the fall. Why so many times? For Rabbi Kushner, he says our slavery, instead of embittering us, it generates this obligation. It pushes each of us to go out there and help those who are in need, to go out there and say, how can I help? What can I do to make the world better? What can I do to you, the person who needs help? The stranger, the widow, the orphan, the marginalized, you name it. What can I do to be of service to help you? Now, the question that the Torah doesn't provide an answer to is, what happens if someone doesn't want to take our help? What happens if someone doesn't want to take the support, the financial resources, the emotional care, whatever it might be that we provide? We haven't forgotten about them, and we're trying not to oppress them, but they don't want to take it. And I think that's something we have to always be aware of, is that when we often put out our hand to help somebody, people may not want to take it. And I think there's numerous reasons as to why that is. First is pride. People want to be able to do for themselves. And that's hard to be able to accept assistance from others when you want to do for yourself. Another is just fear. Fear of, if I take someone's help, if I see that someone is giving me love, I may not be able to give anything back to them. And for a lot of people, they want to be able to say thank you in return. I owe you one, right? And that's really hard if you're not able to take the support. But I think what Rabbi Kushner points to us is this: we have to identify, and we have an obligation to identify and recognize the people who need help, the people who are, so to speak, the other. By the way, if anybody, I see you also. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome, or comments, you're welcome to speak. But I think that the hard part is getting started. Is that, what is that jumping off point for us to be able to get to the point where we can then go out and help others? I'll share a story. Take my screen down so I can actually see you fully. I'll share a story that I was in high school and I went to Washington, D.C. I spoke about this in a sermon I gave, I think, on Yom Kippur last year. And I went to Washington, D.C. on a program called Panim, which literally means faces. Rabbi Sid Schwartz, who is a leader in the social justice world and is a Reconstructionist rabbi emeritus in Maryland. And he does a program, they did a program called Street Torah, where we would go out into the streets of Washington, D.C., McPherson Square, Logan Square, DuPont, Foggy Bottom, all those big areas that have a large homelessness community and population. And we go out during the day and we would engage in what he called Street Torah. Street Torah was twofold. Number one, it was giving to people things that they needed to be able to stay on the streets, whether that was toiletries, warm socks, et cetera, food. The other piece of that was engaging in the Torah of communication and the Torah of actually speaking to these people and giving them the opportunity to see that they are a human being, created in the image of God, just like you and me, and actually have conversations. And I remember I did it once as a participant in high school. And then I did it when I was a little older. I went and participated in the program as like more of a staff presence. And I remember the conversations, and I remember how I felt with the experience, and watching people who were a little bit more afraid of having these conversations. I took a group. It was Los Angeles Hebrew High School. When I was in college, I was their teacher. I took them to DC, and watching these kids who grew up in the Valley, Calabasas, Sherman Oaks, West Hills area, and interacting with these people in the community who we don't ever have conversations with, who we don't ever engage with. It was really powerful. And it empowered me to be able to support these kids, these high school students, in a really challenging and difficult experience. And I think that for Rabbi Kushner, with his idea that instead of making it worse and harder, we have to really just identify and name it. And that's one step, is naming that this is an issue, naming that there are people who need love, who need support, who need welcoming. And going out and doing it takes a little bit of support on your own to be able to go and do so. So go back to the text here. And again, if anybody has any comments or questions, you're welcome to share. Oops. Rabbi Ismar Schwartz was the former, now two previous chancellors of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he's also a professor of history. He writes on this week's Parsha a number of years ago, he says, not once, but twice says our Parsha, we read those verses, warn us against abusing the vulnerable non-Israelite in our midst. And each time the admonition is anchored in the past. History clearly impacts here on the spirit and the contours of halakha, of Jewish law, but also on just the way that we live our life. Because the root of halakha is halach, or the path, the way we go, the way we travel. The bitter taste of slavery honed Israel's moral sense. For Rabbi Dr. Schorsch, the importance is not obviously to abuse the vulnerable, but it's also a reminder of the past. And more often than not, those 36 times that we see this phrase of don't oppress and don't abuse the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the other, what follows is the second clause of because we were once that group of people, right? And that has shaped our way of living our life. Again, the holiday of Passover, we say Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, that we're supposed to go to Egypt. First things early on that we say is B'chol Dor Vador, in each and every generation, Chayav Adam Lirot, every person is obligated to see et atzmo, themselves, Ke'ilu, Yatzami Mitzrayim, that it is as if we came out of Egypt. And we're all living in our Egypt, right? A Meitzar is a narrow place, is a place of fear. It is a place of struggle. Min ha-Meitzar, the psalmist says, Karatia, from this narrow place, from this dire straits, I call out. How do we remember that we came from those narrow places and then move forward and recognize that there are still people in those narrow places? Yeah, Marilyn, please. And then Ellen.
Excuse me. What I wanted to say is it's like a delicate balance about how one views the past versus now. When we celebrate, we don't regard ourselves as victims. Mm-hmm. We celebrate our liberation. And with the celebration, I think there's a certain responsibility to keep the mindset in a certain perspective. Mm-hmm. If you're not humble about it and you go out and try to help whomever that needs our help, you have to do it with humility, because if you come from a place of, look, I'm not a victim anymore, but you're a victim and I'm going to help you, I mean, that doesn't accomplish anything. So I think there's a moral imperative there to have the correct mindset. It's not just we were slaves in the land of Egypt and look what we accomplished. I mean, it's to view the depth of what we have and what we accomplished and what we are required by Jewish law to do for the rest of the world.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it does. And Ellen, before you ask her comment, Marilyn, I just want to validate that part of doing that is just having your own social, personal awarenesses in general. And it's really hard. And people live in denial about things. right? There are moments where we each kind of just struggle to admit that we're in the position that we're in. And that's part of the challenge with mental health and mental illness as a whole is for a lot of people, they don't want to admit that there's something wrong or addiction or whatever. And I think that that's half of the battle is to Ki'ilu yatsami mitzrayim. It's as if we were there. Like it's really, really hard. You're right. Ellen, please.
I have a couple thoughts, of course, just one. One is that I found my own self, the harder something is for me, the more often I need to hear that I have to do it. So the fact that there's 36 or 42 says to me, this is one of the hardest things that we have to do as Jews.
Yeah.
So it's forever in front of our face. This is going to be hard for you, but you still have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I think what I've learned from Torah and just Jewish practice is that we are meant to be partners of God in repairing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people that all the time. And even who don't, if I'm the only Jew they know, I always mention that. It's my job to be a partner in making the world a better place. So in order to do that, we have to, it means we need to be aware of those who need us the most and how do we work with them so that they take what they need and take it with dignity. And then I guess I have a third thought, Rabbi, is that we are safer when we're kinder to the people around us.
Mm-hmm. Not just safer to the people around us, but we're kinder to ourselves.
No.
I think that's huge. And Owen, you mentioned like making the world a little bit better. We say 3 times a day in the Aleinu, L'takein olam b'malchut shaddai, that we should repair, fix, strengthen, whatever word you want to use for tikkun, olam, this world, b'malchut shaddai, in God's kingship, in God's rule, in God's happy place that God made for us and for God's self. And that's, I mean, if you ask me I think one of the hardest pieces about being Jewish is really making the world better. Tikkun olam. I'm not talking about like a mitzvah project that a kid would do for their bar bat mitzvah, which are all important and great, but like real tikkun as a whole. And if you study with Rabbi Kamras and Musar, you know that this concept of tikkun is just an ongoing, challenging process. The process of tshuva. Right? When we talk about tshuva, we oftentimes think that tshuva is just repentance, just saying, I'm sorry, I did this. But tshuva also has other meanings. Tshuva is returning, is going back. But tshuva is also an answer. And in that, we have all these different avenues that we can travel down, and it ain't easy.
Well, and being self-aware is really hard. So it's a reminder, a continual reminder.
Yeah.
Know yourself, and then you can do good for others, I think.
Yeah. Marilyn?
Now, I was thinking of the Jewish role in the civil rights movement, and how a good section of the Jewish population, not the whole section, but how they were really helpful in the civil rights movement, but there came a point where they got kicked out.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also another issue is when you have these good intentions and people, there comes to a point where your good intentions are no longer accepted, how you react to that. Are you supposed to feel wounded, or are you supposed to say, well, we did what we did and we can still aspire to do more, but not be destroyed by it? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. It's harder for me to relate to that statement because I wasn't alive during the civil rights movement, but I'm very much alive in the civil rights movements that are happening like now.
Yeah, I mean,
they're not, it's not the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, but it is very much its own movement today. But yeah, totally.
Because you want, your intentions might not be accepted by other groups.
Yeah.
Even though you have, but yours are good, but they have other agendas too. And how do you not let that defeat what you want to do for the world.
Yeah. Excellent points. Ellen, go ahead.
Well, I would say that if one particular organization doesn't want us to be a part of it, there's plenty of other places we can direct energy.
Right.
And I felt that way when the women's movement, after a certain president was elected, was finally, they just wanted to have their leadership be the people like themselves, not people who are the other. And yeah, I respect that. It was so moving on. Yeah. It's a matter of pride. If they want to get on, go for it.
Yeah.
And it's a little tough.
The world, isn't it? A blessing and a curse, at least. Rabbi Charles Shulman was a Russian-American rabbi who lived in the early part of the 20th century. He says that when we let God into ourselves, we open our hearts to a world where we see others made like us in the common image of divinity, right? Where we see people who are also made B'Tselem Elohim, just like we are. The ancient Jews were told by their lawgiver Moses to remember the stranger, and this was a challenge to them to build a future where nobody would be a stranger. It's just like, it's so simple, but it is so complex. Yeah, Marilyn.
Our enemies use this as a weapon against us.
Say more.
For instance, today with the asylum seekers and refugees.
Okay.
The alt-right, wants to make it that Jews are part of these global conspiracies to control the world, and by inundating the countries with others, and so they're using our imperative Torah, to go against us. That's part of the anti-Semitic tropes today.
It's not the first time, and it's not going to be the last time where people who are not Jewish, and really anybody for that matter, uses let's call it a Torah-itic, a concept from the Torah, and the opposite way in which it was meant to be used. And these are people who, Jews, non-Jews, those who read the Bible, whether the old side or the new side. Yeah.
That's the irony.
It's deep-seated irony, that's for sure. Yeah. What I love about this is that he was a Russian immigrant, and or immigrated to the United States very early on compared to some others. But when we let God into ourselves, I love this idea. We have to let God into ourselves, or embrace and engage with the fact that we have God in each of us, to a world where we see others made like us, that there's no differences between any of us, that we all have this common image of divinity, which is a very, I think, poetic way of saying that we're created in the image of God. I would also say common image of dignity as well. I would add that, because I think that part of being made in the image of God is also engaging in not only divinity, but in dignity. The ancient Jews were told by their lawgiver Moses to remember the stranger, and this was a challenge to them to build a future where nobody would be a stranger. Halavai, as with many of these pieces of text. Hermann Cohn, German Jewish philosopher during the 18th, 19th century, 19th and 20th century, the stranger was to be protected, although he was not a member of one's family, clan, religion, community, or people, simply because he was a human being. And the stranger, therefore, man discovered the idea of humanity, that within each of us, we can find this humanity, which I spoke about before you all popped in, but this idea that exists within humanity of vulnerability and a state of people. Yeah, Marilyn.
But the ultra-Orthodox, the ones that are really acidic, I don't see where they adhere to this.
That's a big challenge, Marilyn. That's a really big challenge in the ultra Haredi, anti-Zionist type sects of Judaism.
And they don't even look
like the Neturei Karta, for example. my favorite piece of this whole anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, but they're still super, super religious, is the temples were destroyed because of a concept called sinat chinam, baseless hatred, right? They didn't love people. They treated people poorly. And they read the same Torah that I do. They study the same halakha and the same Gemara and the same everything else that I do, but they miss such a huge piece of the puzzle of how to treat people with respect.
Even Jews, fellow Jews.
Fellow Jews. And I remember I went to APAC one year, and Nature Carta, these people always camp out outside of the convention center in Washington, D.C. for APAC. It's the largest gathering of people supporting the state of Israel. Mm-hmm. And I remember I went one time and someone asked me, it's like, why are these Haredi Jews protesting Israel and being like anti-Jewish? And I had to really think carefully about how I answer that question, because part of it, I really don't get it. But it also says that there's, can you hear that? There's someone fixing a pipe in our building, so I'll speak close to the microphone.
The Torah Carte.
The Torah, like exactly. They don't want me to teach Torah and us to learn Torah. But Marilyn, it's a really great question. Is these people are Jewish, and they read and
it's okay. Keep going.
Appreciate all the things that I do as well, but they do it in the opposite way, and that's really a struggle. So,
but
right,
not
go ahead.
Not even the Nature Carte, just the Hasidic sects or the ultra religious. They don't even view us as authentic. I mean, they're not nice to us. So,
yeah. So, all right, I want to move a little further so we can get to the big text. I came across this text. I've actually never heard of. I can't even pronounce it. Does anybody know?
Is it Tecumseh?
Tecumseh. Yeah.
Is it Tecumseh? Okay.
Yeah.
A Shawnee chief and warrior who promoted resistance to the expansion of the U.S. into Native American lands. I'd never heard of this person before. But there's something about this quote. Always give a word or a sign of salute when meeting passing a friend or even a stranger, even if in a lonely place. When I worked as a hospital chaplain, we had a rule. It's called the 10-5 rule. Within 10 feet of seeing somebody, you had to acknowledge their presence like with your eyes and a nod or something of that, smile. And within 5 feet, you had to say something to them. You had to say hello. You had to say, good to see you, or good morning, or whatever it is. And it goes so far. Even if they're on the street, panhandling for money, they are a human being and they deserve for you to say, good morning. How are you? I went to do a funeral a couple of months ago and I forgot my water bottle. So I stopped at 7-Eleven to grab a bottle of water. And there's a man who's camped outside of the 7-Eleven next to where I live on Robertson, on Olympic and La Cienega. It's a very busy street in the intersection of Beverly Hills and the city in LA. And I walked in and I said good morning to him. I'm dressed in my suit because I'm going to go to the funeral. And I said, can I get you something? He's like, would you get me a cup of coffee? And I said, sure. I said, you want to come? He said, I'll wait outside. I said, okay. So I walked and I didn't have a problem buying him a cup of coffee and a banana because I know that, that's not going to be used for drugs or, anything that wouldn't be helpful for this person. But the number of people who I saw walk in and out who ignored him. And I'm guilty of ignoring people also. I'm not perfect by any means. But that morning I saw him standing there and he looked at me and we engaged and I felt and I wanted to help if I could. And, we have to do that. Okay. So the last text that I want to look at together is an excerpt from a Devar Torah that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory gave a number of years ago, first published in 2008, on this idea of loving the stranger. And it really just, it hits home in so many ways. So Marilyn, would you start reading for us? We'll read this paragraph and then we'll stop and then we'll read the next paragraph. So go ahead.
Okay. Sure. Dislike of the unlike is as old as mankind. This fact lies at the very heart of the Jewish experience. It is no coincidence that Judaism was born in two journeys away from the two greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Abraham's from Mesopotamia, Moses and the Israelites from pharaonic Egypt. The Torah is the world's greatest, the Torah is the world's great protest against empires and imperialism. Their most serious offense for the prophets as well as the Mosaic books was the use of power against the powerless, the widow, the orphan, and above all, the stranger.
Okay, so we'll stop there. If only it was really mind-blowing and earth-shattering that Rabbi Sachs made the statement, he said, dislike of the unlike is old as mankind. If only that was a new statement. Right? He's not telling us anything that we don't already know. And he tells us that it comes from, and he gives us a little bit of a history lesson in his very Rabbi Sachs way. I mean, if you've never read Rabbi Sachs' stuff, first of all, I highly encourage you to do so. But this is like classic Sachs. Okay? He gives it to us in this very historical and personal explanation that Judaism was born from two different stories. Abraham and Moses' story. So the immediate question is, do those two stories ever overlap? And are they supposed to overlap? And number two is, which one are we supposed to live? And so that's my question for us right this second. Which one are we supposed to live and do they overlap? To refresh your memories, because it's been a little bit since we read about Abraham. Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. The covenant was established through him. He was promised numerous stars in the sky and sand on the ocean, right? He was promised that the generations would follow him and we would be Bnei Abraham, that we would be the generation follow. He is the father of Isaac, who's the father of Jacob. We are Bnei Yisrael, right? That's where that comes from. That is us, the Jewish people. The Moses story, which is still developing over the next number of months in our Torah reading, is Moses was the person who took us from bondage, from slavery, and freed us and guided us and provided us the laws, the Torah, a way to communicate with God and with each other, a way to decide law and justice, and ultimately led us to the gates for us to continue growing as a people. So, do they overlap? Number one. And number two, which one are we supposed to live? And try not to read ahead on the right side. I know it's hard when you have the text there.
Clever, you're right.
I know, right? I can just take the screen. I'll just take the There you go. And I don't think there's one answer or a right answer. I just want to put that out there. Go ahead, Ellen.
Just on first thought, I think they're two different kinds of journeys.
Okay.
Abraham lived as a man in his time, in his place, with his family and his clan, and seemed to be at one with his environment. He knew where he needed to be careful, and he knew where he was strong, and he was welcoming and loving to his family for the most part. And I think of him as a kind of at peace with the surroundings. And when I think of Moshe, he took a bunch of people who were slaves that knew not know freedom and turned them into warriors who were ready to take over a land that wasn't theirs, or that may have been theirs centuries and centuries ago. And I think both kinds of person are needed for survival.
Excellent. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn, did you have something also? Okay.
No.
Okay. Yeah. It's this like intersection of worlds colliding and stories colliding. And you could ask the question, if I ask you, you could have dinner with anybody from the Bible, who are you going to pick? Well, these are two of my top picks for sure. And I would love to just sit with the three of us as a Beit Din to have a conversation to really just, what advice could Moses have given Abraham, and what advice could Abraham given Moses? And what could I have told them or whatever it is. It's really powerful. And again, this is typical Sachs. Yeah, Marilyn.
I was going to say that Abraham establishes the line, and he connects the future generations. I mean, he sets the roadmap for the future generations, and Moses takes it into more of a reality situation in terms of the laws and it's like a link. One links to the other.
I'll use a sports metaphor for just a moment. So if you're not a sports fan, pardon my metaphor.
I did watch the last 15 minutes of the Rams game, so maybe I.
Listen, I won't say go Rams because I know who my rabbi is here, and he's a Niners fan. But I'll say go Chiefs. Okay. The sports metaphor is that Abraham is the coach drawing up the play, and Moses is the quarterback or the point guard or the whoever to make that play happen. But the one who's watching up above, the coordinator, the owner, the whatever, that's God.
Yeah. And
the coach and the player can't do anything without that contract that they have through God. Mm-hmm. So that's my sports metaphor for today. Okay, Marilyn, will you just read the paragraph on the right now? There's one more page after this of 2 paragraphs. So let's read the next one.
Okay, to be a Jew is to be a stranger. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that this is why Abraham is commanded to leave land, home, and father's house. Why, long before Joseph was born. Abraham was also told that his descendants would be strangers in a land not their own. Why Moses had to suffer personal exile before assuming leadership of the people. Why the Israelites underwent persecution before inheriting their own land. And why the Torah is so insistent that this experience, the retelling of the story on Pesach, along with the never forgotten taste of the bread of affliction and the bitter herbs of slavery, should become a permanent part of their collective memory.
That was an incredibly long sentence. And that's Rabbi Sachs's way of saying that you cannot avoid the history that we've had. Mm-hmm. You can't put to the side this notion of slavery and strangerness. I'm going to make that word up if it's not already a word. Strangerness. That is who we are. That is our story. And it is in our DNA to the point where if you forget it, you forget really who you are. Right? The Mishnah in Avot says you should know where you came, where you're going, and before whom you're standing. And while it brings out for us very different answers than what I'm about to say, but know where we came from. We came from this place that was strange, that was hard, that was difficult. Where are we going? God willing, we're going to a place that it's a lot straighter and a lot more colorful and a lot more communal. And for whom we're standing, the person who helped us get from that narrow spot to where we're going.
But if we can't remember who we are and where we came from, there's always going to be somebody that's going to remind us who we are.
Exactly. So let's finish with Rabbi Sachs. Ellen, would you mind reading for us? I'm going to go on mute so that you don't have to listen to the background noise of the drilling.
Just tell me where to start.
You can read the paragraph on the left.
It is terrifying in retrospect to grasp how seriously the Torah took the phenomenon of xenophobia, hatred of the stranger. It is as if the Torah were saying with the utmost clarity, reason is insufficient, sympathy is inadequate. Only the force of history and memory is strong enough to form a counterweight to hate. I'm going
to let that sink in for a moment. It's terrifying to admit that there's even a notion that people don't like other people, right? It's hard to move forward with this history because history is still repeating itself today. But where I think Rabbi Sachs really drives his point home is in this last paragraph. Matt, would you be willing to read for us?
Yeah, on the right.
Yes, please. This is the pièce de résistance as far as I'm concerned for Rabbi Sachs, for us
All right,
to
it's gonna be a
remember.
challenge on my phone.
It's okay.
Why should you not hate the stranger? Asked the Torah. Because you once stood where he stands now. You know the heart of the stranger because you were once a stranger in the land of Egypt. If you are human, so is he. If he is less than human, then so are you. You must fight the hatred in your heart. As I once fought the greatest ruler and the strongest empire in the ancient world on your behalf. I made you into the world's archetypical stranger so that you would fight for the rights of strangers, for your own and those of others, wherever they are, whoever they are, whatever they are, whatever the color of the skin or the nature of the culture. Because though they are not in your image, says God, they are nonetheless in mine. There is only one reply strong enough to answer the question. Why should, and then I got no more screen.
Why should I not hate the stranger? Because the stranger is me. You did great, Matt.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm going to leave this here. I think for us, the world that we live in will continue to be full of opportunities for us to grow in whatever way that might be. And the challenge is for us to figure out not what we're going to grow into, but how we're going to start. And I want to leave you with one more quote from Rabbi Sachs. He wrote in his book, To Heal a Fractured World, about how to build together a more just and loving society. And with this, we'll end. He says the following. He says, as long as there is hunger, poverty, and treatable disease in the world, there is work for us to do. As long as nations fight and men hate and corruption stalks the corridors of power, as long as there is unemployment, homelessness, depression, and despair, our task is not yet done. And we hear, if we listen carefully enough, the voice of God asking us, as God asked the first humans, where are you? So with that, I will say, Shabbat Shalom, Toda Rabah. Come this Shabbat morning, you can see and listen to or watch our very own Ellen Cervantes will be giving the sermon this Shabbat on Parshat Mishpatim. If she hasn't already written, she's got plenty of material to choose from here. And
all up here.
Yeah, right. We'll see you all on Shabbat. Lunch and Learn through the month of February, just so you all know, is still going to be happening, but we're going to have a couple of different teachers because I'm going to be away the majority of the Thursdays in February applying and interviewing at communities around the country. So Cantor Raffi will be here. I think Chazan Joel Smith will be here. There might be one other person. I think I'll be back for one of the weeks, but we will still have Lunch and Learn during February. And then Rabbi Cantor, and we'll be able to learn together with him then, and we'll go from there. So wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay well. And for those of you joining us on the live stream, it's always great to be with you. And we will see you all when we see you all.
Yasher Koach.
Safe travels, David.
Thank you very much.
All the best to you all.